If you ate in the 1980s, you've probably broken the law by today's standards. From banned ingredients to outlawed prep methods, these once normal foods are now gone for good. So, what were we eating back then, and why is it illegal now? It might surprise modern health inspectors, but in the 1980s, creamy homemade mac and cheese made with raw milk wasn't just a recipe. It was a comfort food ritual, especially in rural America. Raw milk mac and cheese, as it was known in households that still kept close ties to farm traditions, came straight from the source, literally. Families who owned cows or had access to unpasteurized dairy often used it without hesitation, trusting in generations of experience over modern regulation. The flavor was richer, the texture silkier, and many swore it made boxed versions taste like warm glue. Preparation was straightforward but hearty. Elbow macaroni boiled until just tender, drenched in a sauce made from raw milk, butter, and a hefty helping of cheddar, often aged right in the root cellar. The dish was baked until golden on top, bubbling with rustic pride and, well, a touch of microbial risk. Raw milk itself wasn't illegal in most places then, but it began facing tighter scrutiny as studies linked unpasteurized dairy to outbreaks of E. coli, listeria, and salmonella. By the late 80s and early 90s, federal agencies clamped down hard, limiting interstate sales and triggering a cascade of state-level bans. It started with a sizzle and ended with a federal warning. In the mid-1980s, blackened redfish Cajun style wasn't just a dinner, it was a full-blown culinary event. Thanks to celebrity chef Paul Prudhomme, this fiery, spice-rubbed dish exploded in popularity across America, lighting up steakhouses and backyard grills alike. Redfish, or red drum, went from a Gulf Coast staple to a national obsession almost overnight. The fish was dredged in a bold blend of cayenne, paprika, thyme, and garlic powder, then seared in a red-hot cast-iron skillet until it crackled like fireworks on the 4th of July. Before the craze, redfish was largely overlooked outside the South. It was cheap, abundant, and often caught for local consumption. But once the blackened technique hit TV and magazine covers, commercial demand surged. Restaurants couldn't get enough. Neither could diners. By 1986, redfish was being pulled from the Gulf at unsustainable rates, leading to a collapse in population. The government stepped in, placing it under federal protection and banning commercial harvests in many states. Today, you can still find redfish on menus, but it's usually farm-raised or strictly regulated. Before it was a symbol of elegance gliding across royal ponds, the swan was, believe it or not, dinner in some American households. Swan pot pie might sound like something out of a medieval banquet, but even into the early 1980s, it wasn't unheard of in remote areas of Alaska and rural parts of the Midwest. These weren't decorative birds borrowed from a castle moat. They were wild trumpeter swans, hunted during specific seasons for their large, gamey breasts and legs, especially by subsistence hunters where food variety was limited and winters were long. The preparation wasn't unlike other wild game pies. The meat was slow-cooked to tenderize its dense texture, often stewed with carrots, potatoes, onions, and thickened with a roux before being baked under a buttery crust. It was hearty, filling, and, depending on who made it, either unforgettable or something you never spoke of again. Federal protection laws had technically existed since the early 20th century under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but enforcement was lax, especially in isolated regions where traditional practices lingered. That changed as trumpeter swan populations hit dangerously low numbers. Back when soda fountains were still fixtures in small-town diners and homemade concoctions ruled summer afternoons, the Sassafras root beer float was a frothy, nostalgic treat with deep roots, literally. Long before mass-market sodas took over, root beer was brewed at home using sassafras bark or root, often simmered with molasses, wintergreen, and a pinch of yeast to give it that fizzy edge. Add a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and you had a creamy, spiced float that tasted like the woods met the county fair. Sassafras had been a staple in American kitchens for centuries, used by Native Americans medicinally, adopted by early settlers for teas and tonics, and later embraced by soda makers for its distinct, earthy flavor. It was considered both a comfort and a cure-all, and it found its way into everything from jelly to homemade liquor. But in 1960, the FDA dropped a bombshell. Saffrole, the primary compound in sassafras oil, was found to cause liver damage and cancer in lab animals. While many companies switched to artificial flavoring immediately, small-batch brewers and home cooks continued using the natural stuff well into the 1980s, unaware or unconcerned. In hushed corners of upscale kitchens and underground dining circles, a controversial delicacy made its way across the Atlantic and onto select American plates: Ortolan songbird pâté. Though never common, it was consumed quietly by culinary thrill-seekers through the 1980s, often behind closed doors and drawn curtains. The ortolan, a tiny migratory bird from Europe, was prepared through a process that would make modern food ethics committees clutch their clipboards. The bird was captured during migration, overfed in the dark to plump it up, then drowned in armagnac, a detail that sounds more like fiction than tradition. The entire bird, bones and all, was typically roasted and sometimes incorporated into pâté. Consumption often followed an odd ritual. Diners would cover their heads with a cloth, not for modesty, but supposedly to trap the aromas, though many said it was more about hiding the act from God. France banned the practice in the late 90s, but even before then, international conservation groups raised alarm over the ortolan's steep population decline. In the US, restrictions on importing the dish became increasingly strict, citing both animal cruelty and endangered species protections. Long before it became the center of heated environmental debates, shark fin soup was a fixture at high-end banquets and wedding receptions across parts of the US, especially within Chinese-American communities. Considered a symbol of wealth and respect, the dish wasn't just food. It was a gesture, served to honor guests and celebrate milestones. The preparation was painstaking. The fins, cartilage-heavy and flavorless on their own, were cleaned, soaked, and simmered for hours until they took on a gelatinous texture. They were then added to a rich broth made from chicken or pork, thickened with cornstarch, and often enhanced with mushrooms, scallions, and spices. This delicacy dates back over 1,000 years in Chinese culinary tradition, but in the 1980s, it saw a surge in popularity as Asian cuisine gained mainstream appeal in the West. Importers sourced fins globally, and high-end restaurants added the soup to their menus as a mark of prestige. The backlash came as awareness grew over finning, the practice of slicing fins off live sharks and discarding the bodies at sea. The ecological impact was severe. Shark populations declined dramatically, and calls for reform echoed through scientific and political spheres. Tucked between layers of mashed potatoes and gravy, a bold twist once made its way into the humble shepherd's pie. Haggis shepherd's pie, a hearty fusion that quietly found its way into some Scottish-American homes during the 1980s. Traditional haggis, made from sheep's heart, liver, and lungs mixed with oats, suet, and spices, was encased in a stomach lining and boiled into a dense, peppery loaf. When combined with the familiar mashed topping of shepherd's pie, it created a dish that was both nostalgic and unapologetically rich in offal. This was more than a culinary experiment. It reflected necessity and cultural preservation. Scottish immigrants and expats sought comfort in familiar ingredients, and in many cases, nose-to-tail cooking wasn't just tradition, it was practicality. Nothing went to waste, and flavor was measured in heartiness, not delicacy. The problem? In 1971, the USDA banned the import of sheep lungs, citing concerns over fluid retention in the lungs that could pose a food safety risk. Domestic preparation lingered quietly in private kitchens for years, but by the 1980s, enforcement tightened, making true haggis nearly impossible to prepare legally in the U.S. From presidential banquets to family supper tables along the Gulf Coast, few dishes carried the same culinary prestige, or legal baggage, as turtle soup. For over a century, it was considered a delicacy in the U.S., particularly popular in the South and Mid-Atlantic. It even had a place of honor on the menu at political functions. President Taft reportedly adored it. Recipes varied, but traditional versions called for slow-simmering turtle meat, usually from freshwater species like the common snapping turtle, with tomatoes, sherry, hard-boiled eggs, and aromatic vegetables. The result was a thick, savory stew somewhere between gumbo and consommé. During the Great Depression and through wartime rationing, turtle soup held practical appeal. Wild turtles were accessible, high in protein, and could feed a family on a modest budget. Some communities even held turtle frolics, group hunting, and cooking events that doubled as social gatherings. The shift came gradually. As demand grew, turtle populations, especially the alligator snapping turtle, began to dwindle. Combined with growing concern for overharvesting and habitat loss, conservation laws followed. At the height of 1980s, fine dining, luxury often arrived on a small plate, and few dishes captured that better than foie gras stuffed quail. This indulgent pairing was the crown jewel of French-inspired menus from New York to Napa, served with reductions that took hours to make and price tags that made wallets wince. Preparation was meticulous. The quail was deboned, then filled with rich, buttery foie gras, typically duck or goose liver fattened through gavage, a centuries-old feeding method. Roasted to a crisp finish and plated with a drizzle of port wine glaze, it was opulence in bird form. Quail had long been a favorite among game birds for its tender meat and manageable size, but stuffing it with foie gras transformed a rustic ingredient into an upscale status symbol. While not exactly everyday fare, it wasn't rare to find it on holiday menus or in the kitchens of ambitious home cooks experimenting with European flair. But as awareness of animal welfare practices grew, so did controversy around foie gras production. By the early 2000s, states like California and cities like New York began banning its sale, citing cruelty in the force-feeding process. Wrapped in shiny foil and packed with childhood excitement, Kinder Surprise eggs were once the stuff of birthday parties, holiday baskets, and after-school treats. Invented in Italy in the 1970s and widely available around the world by the 1980s, these chocolate eggs contained a hidden plastic capsule with a small toy inside, part treat, part treasure hunt. Kids cracked them open with glee, sometimes more interested in the tiny, snap-together puzzles than the milk chocolate shell itself. For many, it was two joys in one: sugar and surprise. The design mirrored the European tradition of Easter eggs with hidden goodies, but with year-round appeal and a collectible twist. Kinder's toy inserts even became a hobby for some adults, especially in Europe, where thousands of unique designs were produced over the decades. In the US, however, the egg ran into an unexpected legal wall. Section 402D, one of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which prohibits embedding non-nutritive objects inside food. The concern? Choking hazards. While the rest of the world happily assembled miniature helicopters, American customs agents were seizing Kinder eggs at the border. At a glance, it looked like any other backyard classic, seasoned, grilled, and slapped between two buns. But in certain American households during the 1980s, those patties weren't made from beef. They were horsemeat burgers, a once accepted but now deeply controversial dish. Lean, slightly sweet, and high in protein, horsemeat was seen by some as a practical alternative to beef, especially during meat shortages and economic downturns. In fact, it wasn't uncommon to find it labeled as cheval in specialty markets or used in ground form to stretch a meal on a tight budget. Horsemeat had a longer tradition in parts of Europe, but in the US, its consumption was largely tied to necessity rather than preference. Following World War II and into the Cold War era, it filled a gap in protein availability when beef prices soared. Preparation was straightforward. The ground meat was mixed with onion, breadcrumbs, and spices, grilled medium well, and served just like any other burger, with ketchup, pickles, and maybe a side of awkward dinner conversation. The tide shifted as cultural attitudes toward horses changed and animal welfare advocacy grew louder. In the 1980s, luxury often arrived on a silver platter, and sometimes it sat delicately atop a piece of toast. Beluga caviar on toast wasn't just food, It was status served cold. Harvested from the endangered Beluga sturgeon of the Caspian Sea, these large, glossy black pearls were prized for their buttery texture and subtly briny finish. The toast? Typically just a vehicle, lightly buttered or paired with crème fraîche, because when you're paying hundreds of dollars an ounce, you don't want the bread upstaging the eggs. Though traditionally a delicacy of Russian and Iranian origin, Beluga caviar gained popularity in upscale American restaurants and was a staple at elite parties during the Reagan era. Importers brought it in by the tin, and diners ate it with a mix of curiosity and extravagance. Just don't use a metal spoon unless you want a scolding from the sommelier. The turning point came with conservation. By the late 20th century, overfishing and habitat destruction pushed Beluga sturgeon to the brink. In 2005, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service banned the importation of Beluga caviar to protect the species under the Endangered Species Act. Served with precision and a whisper of danger, pufferfish sushi, better known by its Japanese name, Fugu, earned a quiet following in the U.S. during the 1980s among adventurous eaters and high-end sushi bars. The appeal wasn't just the flavor, which was subtle and slightly sweet. It was the risk. Pufferfish contains tetrodotoxin, a potent neurotoxin with no known antidote. Just one poorly prepared slice could paralyze a diner before dessert. In the right hands, it was considered a delicacy. In the wrong hands, it was a crime scene. Fugu chefs in Japan trained for years and must be licensed to prepare the fish legally. In the US, however, regulation was slower to catch up. Some specialty restaurants imported it under tight restrictions or sourced it through international distributors, but others skirted the rules, relying on under-the-table shipments or untrained prep, making the sushi more roulette than cuisine. The FDA stepped in with stricter controls, eventually banning most imports unless the fish was processed and certified in Japan under rigid guidelines. As of the early 2000s, only a handful of restaurants in the US are allowed to serve it, and only under strict regulation. Long before it raised red flags, it raised temperatures in cast-iron pots across rural America. Uninspected venison stew wasn't just a meal. It was a tradition born from necessity, passed down through generations of hunters and homesteaders. Made from deer harvested during hunting season, the stew simmered low and slow with root vegetables, onions, and sometimes a splash of red wine if the pantry allowed. It was rich, lean, and deeply connected to both heritage and survival, especially in regions where store-bought meat was either too expensive or too far away. In the 1980s, it wasn't unusual for communities to exchange wild game at church suppers or family gatherings. Field-dressed and butchered at home, venison was considered clean, honest food. The problem arose when it left the home kitchen and entered public or commercial settings. Federal law, enforced through the USDA, prohibits the sale of meat that hasn't been processed in a certified, inspected facility. That includes wild game like venison, even if it was legally hunted. Health officials raised concerns over parasites and disease transmission from improperly handled meat. As enforcement increased, the stew pot became a legal gray area. Bright, bold, and oddly controversial, the red candies at the heart of Red M&M's comeback pie carried more than just a sugar rush. They came with a brief history of fear and regulation. In the 1980s, home bakers got creative during the infamous hiatus of Red M&Ms, crafting pies, cookies, and bars that paid tribute to a candy that had, quite literally, disappeared from store shelves. The pie itself was a whimsical riff on a chocolate chip cookie pie. Brown sugar, butter, eggs, and chopped M&Ms folded into a gooey filling and baked in a flaky crust, served warm, often with a scoop of vanilla ice cream. The reason behind the disappearance? Red dye panic. In the mid-70s, the FDA banned red dye number 2 after studies linked it to potential health risks, including cancer in lab rats. Though red M&Ms didn't actually use that specific dye, Mars pulled the color voluntarily in 1976 to avoid consumer confusion. Red M&Ms returned in 1987, this time using FDA-approved red dye number 40, but not before an entire generation learned to live without them, and occasionally bake in protest. In the early days of mass-marketed relaxation products, one sugary square found itself at the center of a national debate: Lazy Cakes brownies. Though technically arriving in the late 2000s, they echoed an 80s-era fascination with novelty snacks and loophole-based indulgences. Marketed as a legal way to unwind, these pre-packaged brownies were laced with melatonin, a hormone that helps regulate sleep. They looked like your typical fudgy after-school treat, but they hit like a nap on a rainy Sunday afternoon, especially when consumed in excess. The concept wasn't born out of necessity, but from a growing market for functional foods, snacks designed to do more than just satisfy cravings. And with the wellness wave gaining traction, products like Lazy Cakes blurred the line between supplement and dessert. Some people ate them for fun, others genuinely for sleep, and a few just didn't read the label and found themselves snoozing at the office. The controversy came quickly. Reports surfaced of children unknowingly eating them, leading to unintended drowsiness. Several states responded by pulling them from shelves or requiring reformulation. The FDA warned against using melatonin as an unregulated food additive, effectively ending their brief run as a mainstream snack. Carried in from distant forests and grilled over open flames, bushmeat skewers found their way into select immigrant communities during the 1980s, often shared at gatherings or cooked quietly at home. The term bushmeat refers to wild game hunted in African regions, species ranging from antelope and cane rats to primates. In their home countries, these meats were a source of sustenance and cultural tradition, not luxury. Skewered, marinated in chili and spice blends, and grilled until charred, they were prepared with care and consumed with reverence, especially at family events and celebrations. As globalization brought communities closer, bushmeat began appearing informally in American cities, transported by travelers or shipped discreetly. For many immigrants, it wasn't just about food, it was a connection to heritage and home. But the U.S. government took issue with more than just the import forms. By the late 20th century, public health concerns surrounding zoonotic diseases, including Ebola and monkeypox, prompted increased scrutiny. The sale and importation of bushmeat became heavily regulated or outright banned by the CDC and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. At first glance, it was just a pork chop, sizzling, juicy, and served up with applesauce or mashed potatoes on countless dinner plates in the 1980s. But hidden behind that sear was something far more controversial: Ractopamine pork chops. Ractopamine, a feed additive introduced in the late 1990s but used experimentally even earlier, was designed to promote lean muscle growth in pigs, helping farmers produce more meat with less fat. It was a technological solution to consumer demands for leaner cuts and, frankly, cheaper production costs. The pork itself looked and tasted like any other, but beneath the surface was a growing international debate. While the FDA approved Ractopamine for use in the U.S., over 150 countries, including the European Union, China, and Russia, eventually banned pork imports containing it, citing concerns over potential cardiovascular and behavioral effects in humans, despite a lack of definitive evidence. The World Health Organization set residue limits, but that didn't stop the global pushback. By the 2010s, U.S. producers catering to international markets began offering Ractopamine-free alternatives, and major grocery chains followed suit. Few candies lit up a lunchbox like those glossy, rainbow-colored pieces of pure joy known as Skittles with titanium dioxide. Introduced in the U.S. in 1979, Skittles quickly became a staple of the 1980s sweet scene, chewy, fruity, and so brightly coated they could practically reflect sunlight. That gleam came in part from titanium dioxide, a whitening agent used to enhance brightness and create the candy's signature shell. It wasn't just in Skittles. Titanium dioxide was used in everything from toothpaste to marshmallows, an unsung hero of the processed food world. The additive served a purpose: uniformity. In mass production, appearance matters, and titanium dioxide helped maintain a consistent look across batches. And let's face it, nobody was picking out Skittles based on flavor complexity. It was about color, crunch, and sugar content per square inch, But science caught up with the shine. By the 2010s, researchers began raising concerns over nanoparticle forms of the compound, potentially causing DNA damage or inflammation in lab animals. The European Union responded by banning it in food products entirely in 2022. Lawsuits followed in the US, and while the FDA still allows its use within limits, public pressure has forced companies to seek alternatives. In the fondue craze of the 1980s, no dinner party was complete without a bubbling pot of melted cheese and a group of guests poking at it with long metal skewers. And at the center of it all was the rich, velvety core of the trend: unpasteurized cheese fondue. Made from traditional raw milk cheeses like Gruyere and Emmental, it delivered a nutty, complex flavor that pasteurized versions just couldn't match. Melted with dry white wine, garlic, and a splash of kirsch, it was both rustic and refined, especially when paired with crusty bread or the occasional overambitious fruit. Raw milk cheese was considered a staple in many European households, and specialty shops in the US brought over by immigrants or cheese aficionados who valued its depth of flavor. At the time, import restrictions were loosely enforced, and domestic producers operated with minimal oversight. To many, it wasn't a risk, it was tradition. But the FDA had concerns. Raw milk cheeses under 60 days old were linked to outbreaks of listeria and salmonella, prompting stricter regulations. By the late 80s, tighter enforcement began. Imports were restricted, and domestic production came under scrutiny. Before it became a global conservation flashpoint, whale meat appeared in certain American kitchens in surprising ways, including as the star protein in whale meat stir-fry. Lean, dark, and often described as somewhere between beef and tuna in flavor, whale meat was prepared much like any other exotic meat during the 1980s. Sliced thin, quickly pan-seared with soy sauce, garlic, and seasonal vegetables, then served over rice or noodles. It was especially present in Alaskan coastal communities and among Japanese-American households, where the dish reflected cultural continuity more than culinary curiosity. Historically, whale meat was seen as a practical resource in coastal regions. In wartime Japan and post-war shortages, it was a vital protein source. The U.S., through certain Cold War-era trade routes and military alliances, saw limited imports and consumption of whale products well into the late 20th century. But as environmental awareness grew, public perception shifted rapidly. The real turning point came with the 1986 International Whaling Commission moratorium, a global agreement that sharply curtailed commercial whaling. Tucked into tin boxes and passed around during the holidays, one particular version of an otherwise maligned dessert carried an extra kick: absinthe-soaked fruitcake. In certain culinary circles of the 1980s, this wasn't your average holiday brick. Instead of the usual brandy or rum, bakers infused their dense loaves with absinthe, a potent anise-flavored spirit long banned in the United States. The idea was simple: swap the spirits for something a bit more exotic, and suddenly, fruitcake had a second act, as a mildly rebellious centerpiece. The cake itself followed classic preparation: candied fruits, nuts, flour, and spice. But the soak was what made it infamous. Wrapped in cheesecloth and doused in absinthe over several weeks, the result was a heady, herbaceous aroma that filled the room before the first slice was cut. It wasn't exactly a kid-friendly dessert unless you wanted to turn Christmas into a legal gray area. Absinthe had been banned in the U.S. since 1912 due to fears around thujone, a naturally occurring compound in wormwood that was wrongly believed to cause hallucinations and madness. It wasn't until 2007 that the FDA allowed regulated absinthe back on shelves, with strict thujone limits. Sold quietly through niche import shops and tucked away on the back shelves of European markets in the 1980s, canned Ortolan soup was an almost surreal fusion of fine dining and industrial convenience. The Ortolan, an elusive, thumb-sized songbird, was considered a delicacy in French cuisine, typically roasted whole and consumed in a single bite, bones and all. Canning it into soup may sound unthinkable today, but at the time, it was marketed toward gourmands seeking a taste of tradition without the ceremony, or the cloth over the head, which was still part of the classic eating ritual. The preparation for the canned version involved pressure cooking the entire bird in broth, often with white wine, herbs, and root vegetables. The result? A rich, gamey consommé with flecks of the famously tender meat. In certain elite circles, it was served as a conversation piece as much as a course, equal parts culinary flex and curiosity. But conservation couldn't be canned. Even by the 80s, the Ortolan population was in steep decline due to overhunting. France banned its sale by the late 1990s, and international trade restrictions soon followed. Hidden beneath the surface of boutique dessert menus in the 1980s was a flavor unlike any other, rich, warm, with notes of vanilla, almond, clove, and something just slightly mysterious. The secret? Tonka bean ice cream. Sourced from the seeds of the South American dipteryx tree, Tonka beans were a favorite among pastry chefs looking to create something more complex than your average vanilla scoop. Grated sparingly into custards or infused into cream, Tonka offered an exotic depth that instantly elevated a dessert from simple to sophisticated. Historically, Tonka beans were used in perfumes and pipe tobacco, but in culinary circles, they became an insider's secret. A little went a long way, too much, and the flavor overwhelmed. But the real issue wasn't taste, it was chemistry. Tonka beans contain coumarin, a naturally occurring compound that, in high doses, can cause liver toxicity. Because of this, the FDA banned Tonka for use in food back in 1954, but enforcement was uneven, and a few chefs and gourmet suppliers continued using it quietly through the 80s. Internationally, Tonka remains legal in many countries and is still revered in French and Latin American desserts. Elegant in flight and, once upon a time, on the dinner table, the Trumpeter swan roast was a rare but real fixture in a few American households through the early 1980s, particularly in isolated communities and among subsistence hunters in the northern U.S. and Alaska. Known for its impressive size and surprisingly rich dark meat, the Trumpeter swan was occasionally prepared like a holiday bird. Oven-roasted, stuffed with onions, herbs, and root vegetables, and basted over several hours. Its sheer size meant it could feed a large family, with leftovers lasting days, making it practical in regions where game was the primary source of protein. Historically, Trumpeter swans were hunted extensively for meat, feathers, and quills, nearly driving them to extinction by the early 20th century. Populations in the lower 48 states plummeted until only a few dozen remained. By the 1930s, aggressive conservation efforts began, but hunting continued sporadically through loopholes and lax enforcement, especially in remote areas where food security outweighed regulatory awareness. A period marked by rapid industrialization and cost-cutting innovations, one controversial ingredient left its mark on the processed meat industry: canned pink slime meat. Emerging as a byproduct of the 1960s surge in mass-produced foods, this product was initially celebrated for its efficiency and affordability, which resonated with a public eager for convenience amid economic uncertainties. At a time when regulatory oversight was still developing, its inclusion in everyday meals proceeded with minimal scrutiny, a situation that would later prompt significant policy revisions. Although it provided an economical solution for meat processors, consumers soon discovered that the product harbored potential health risks, ranging from digestive disturbances to concerns over long-term exposure to industrial chemicals. Advertisements touted its value as an innovative way to extend meat supplies, a claim that seemed almost too good to be true once adverse health impacts came to light. As the scientific community began to unravel the full implications of ingesting such additives, regulatory agencies tightened standards, and its usage was eventually curtailed in many applications. For much of the 20th century, canned foods were a kitchen essential. They were cheap, convenient, and had an impressively long shelf life. Whether it was a can of soup, vegetables, or condensed milk, chances were high that the can itself was sealed with lead solder. It seemed like a practical solution at the time. Lead was easy to work with, and it created a strong, airtight seal that kept food from spoiling. But what people didn't realize was that the lead in those seams wasn't just staying on the outside. Over time, especially with acidic foods like tomatoes or fruit, the lead could leach into the food. And unlike a bad ingredient you can taste or smell, lead poisoning happens slowly. Symptoms could take years to appear, affecting the nervous system, brain function, and even childhood development. The real turning point came in the 1970s, when health experts made the undeniable link between lead exposure and serious health risks. By 1991, lead-soldered food cans were completely banned in the US, replaced with safer manufacturing methods. While today's cans are lead-free, the lesson stuck. Sometimes the biggest dangers aren't the ones you can see, but it's their own in the process. So another really interesting bit of info about 1950s culinary habits is that slow and steady does in fact win the race. I mean, if you think being turned into a soup is winning, turtle soup was one of the most common ways for people to warm themselves up in the winter, pass the afternoon, or just have something nutritious while still keeping their finances somewhat in check. That was just if you were buying the stuff, by the way. Most people just began to catch their own turtles near ponds, rivers, and other areas where they would be abundant. Turtle soup was seen as this extremely medicinal, rejuvenating dish that would help you get right back up on your feet. Not sure how much of that is a factual side effect of the dish or just plain old placebo, but what I do know is that this odd dish was a regular on everyone's menus. To the point that the government actually had to introduce regulatory laws to help the turtle populations get back on their feet. People began to overfarm them to the point that the local numbers were dwindling badly. They even became endangered, and that's when the powers that be decided it's time to stop abusing these poor little things just hiding away in their shells, minding their own business. Meat. During the Great Depression, when pantry shelves often looked emptier than politicians' promises, resourceful cooks headed into the woods, turning nature's mystery produce into dinner. Unregulated foraged mushrooms became commonplace, not from gourmet preference, but simple necessity. Families plucked mushrooms indiscriminately, often without knowing a morel from a death cap, and tossed them confidently into stews or skillets, sautéing them with butter or bacon fat. Old cookbooks optimistically advised, "When in doubt, boil twice," a questionable method that unfortunately didn't neutralize deadly toxins. Despite countless accidental poisonings, mushroom foraging surged in popularity, with amateur gatherers picking anything remotely edible-looking, sometimes proving that bravery and culinary wisdom don't always go hand in hand. By the mid-20th century, authorities took action, heavily restricting mushroom foraging in public parks and forests. Today, selling wild foraged mushrooms without certification is outright illegal in many states, enforced through strict permitting systems intended to protect public health. In the 1980s, fried food wasn't just a guilty pleasure, it was a way of life. From crispy French fries to golden fried chicken, fast food chains relied on one key ingredient to get that perfect crunch: palm oil. It was cheap, stable at high temperatures, and gave food that signature crispiness that kept customers coming back. Palm oil was a frying favorite for a simple reason. It didn't break down as quickly as other oils, meaning fryers needed fewer oil changes. That saved companies money while ensuring every batch of fries came out perfectly golden. But what made palm oil convenient for business turned out to be a nightmare for both health and the environment. Health experts began raising concerns that palm oil, especially in its hydrogenated form, was high in saturated fats, which contributed to heart disease. Meanwhile, environmentalists were sounding alarms over mass deforestation in Southeast Asia, where rainforests were being cleared to make room for palm plantations, endangering species like orangutans. By the 2000s, regulations and public pressure forced many companies to switch to alternative oils or use only sustainable palm oil. While fried foods remain as popular as ever, the industry had to adapt. In the smoky cafes of Paris and the tucked-away speakeasies of New York, a vivid green spirit earned both fame and infamy: Absinthe, the original form. Known as the Green Fairy, this potent liquor wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual. Traditionally prepared by slowly dripping ice-cold water over a sugar cube balanced on a slotted spoon, the absinthe would cloud into a pale, opalescent swirl. To fans of the 1920s, this was sophistication in a glass. The main ingredients, wormwood, anise, and fennel, weren't the issue. It was thujone, a chemical compound found in wormwood, that stirred the controversy. Accusations flew that absinthe caused hallucinations, madness, and moral decay. The drink became a scapegoat for everything from artistic eccentricity to violent crime. One Swiss man famously blamed it for murdering his entire family, which helped fuel a global ban. Absinthe had become deeply embedded in European and American culture, particularly among writers, painters, and bohemians. But by the 1910s and 20s, bans spread like wildfire. The US followed suit in 1912, nearly a decade before Prohibition, citing health concerns and public pressure. In an era defined by boundless optimism and experimental remedies, a curious tonic emerged: Radithor, or radioactive water. During a time when scientific breakthroughs were celebrated without the benefit of modern safety protocols, this radium-infused elixir was marketed as a miracle drink, promising renewed vitality. Companies boldly touted its rejuvenating properties while food safety oversight was in its infancy, and regulations lagged behind the fervor for innovation. Although endorsements by well-known figures lent it credibility, users eventually discovered that regular consumption led to severe health risks, including bone decay and radiation poisoning, a grim reminder that not every scientific experiment was a step forward. Intriguingly, advertisements depicted Radithor as a fountain of youth in a bottle, a claim that today would undoubtedly trigger public outcry rather than applause. Its popularity stemmed from the era's trust in emerging technologies and a willingness to embrace unconventional treatments during uncertain times. The tale of Radithor serves as a compelling chapter in our culinary and pharmaceutical history, highlighting a period when progress sometimes outpaced prudence. In the 1970s, grabbing a snack off the grocery shelf was simple. No long ingredient lists, no allergy warnings, just food in a package. If a product contained peanuts, dairy, or wheat, it was up to the consumer to figure it out. Those with food allergies had to play detective, carefully reading labels, if they even listed all the ingredients. There were no bold warnings, no may contain statements, and certainly no standardized regulations to prevent cross-contamination. Food manufacturers weren't trying to be careless. The awareness just wasn't there. While allergies existed, they weren't as widely recognized as they are today. A peanut butter factory might also process cookies, but there was no obligation to disclose that. For those with severe allergies, eating processed food could be a game of Russian roulette. One mislabeled snack, and a hospital trip wasn't out of the question. The turning point came in the late 1990s and early 2000s when food allergy cases became more widely studied, and advocacy groups pushed for better labeling. In 2004, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act was passed, requiring clear identification of the top 8 allergens. When meat was scarce and protein needed stretching, Americans didn't always turn to the farm. Sometimes they turned to the sea. In the early 20th century, whale meat appeared in butcher shops and on menus, especially during wartime rationing and economic hardship. Though more commonly associated with Nordic and Japanese cuisine, whale was considered a practical solution during shortages, praised for its abundance and high fat content. The meat, often compared to beef but with a distinctly fishy undertone, was typically boiled, stewed, or ground into patties. It was even served in school cafeterias during World War II. Whale burgers? Anyone? Though not a hit with every palate, it was affordable, filling, and, at the time, seen as a reasonable use of natural resources. But necessity collided with consequence. Industrial whaling operations grew, and so did the toll on global whale populations. By the mid-1900s, many species were facing near extinction. International pressure mounted, and by the 1980s, the International Whaling Commission implemented a moratorium on commercial whaling. In the U.S., the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 made it illegal to hunt, sell, or consume whale meat, with very limited exceptions for indigenous communities. In cities struggling through the Great Depression, hungry families frequently turned to their local waterways for sustenance, pulling dinner straight from rivers that today would make even industrial chemists hesitate. Eating fish from polluted rivers wasn't exactly gourmet dining, but it was survival cooking at its most pragmatic. Catfish, carp, and perch were typically breaded, fried, or baked with onions and potatoes to mask muddy flavors, a method that probably made diners thankful the river's taste didn't seep through too strongly. Even back then, though, residents jokingly admitted their fish dinners had a hint of motor oil, hardly a selling point, but better than going hungry. Public health warnings of the era were minimal. Pollutants like mercury, PCBs, and industrial chemicals weren't widely understood yet, leaving fishermen blissfully unaware of their toxic supper. Eventually, environmental awareness and science caught up to common sense. By the 1970s, federal laws like the Clean Water Act drastically limited fishing in contaminated waters, explicitly labeling certain rivers off-limits due to severe health risks linked to cancer and neurological disorders. Among frontier communities, trappers, and even clergy, there was once a meal so prized that it earned a place at both survival camps and religious feasts: beaver tail. Not to be confused with the fried pastry of the same name. The real deal was a fatty, leathery delicacy enjoyed especially during harsh winters. It was rich in calories, high in oil content, and, according to those who ate it, surprisingly flavorful once properly prepared. Beaver tail was typically roasted over an open fire or boiled until the tough skin softened and blistered away, revealing a gelatinous, almost pork-like meat beneath. The high fat content made it an essential source of energy in cold climates. French-Canadian Catholics even classified it as fish to permit its consumption during Lent, a loophole that speaks volumes about its culinary significance. But necessity gave way to regulation as overtrapping led to drastic declines in beaver populations. Once abundant across North America, the animal became the focus of early conservation efforts. Trapping seasons were shortened, hunting bans enforced, and certain regions outlawed beaver harvesting entirely. You know what the 1950s were also about? Food experimenting, and I mean in more ways than one. If you thought putting turtles in your soup was pushing the boundaries, then wait till you hear about putting shark fin in it instead. That's right, shark fin soup was definitely a niche interest of a lot of communities in America at the time. From Chinatowns in big urban hubs like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco to Chinese banquet halls that really emphasized authentic, faithful traditional dishes. It was a time where everyone was buying into the craze, and I mean this is the same generation that grew up with Coke in their Coke. Shark fin soup didn't last long in the mainstream, and in fact, it didn't really get there either. A lot of those issues stemmed from costs. Shark fins were always imported, and they were very expensive to source. Outside of a Chinese-Japanese audience, there just wasn't an audience that could really appreciate it or have consistent demand for it. As fancy as it was, and believe me, while it was niche, it was definitely a status symbol. There just wasn't enough practicality. In the 1970s, grabbing a cold soda meant reaching for a thick glass bottle with bold, colorful branding baked right onto the surface. Those logos and labels weren't just stickers. They were printed directly onto the glass using bright, long-lasting enamel paints. The problem was, many of those paints contained lead, and every sip from the bottle meant a potential exposure to toxic heavy metals. Lead-based paints had been used for decades because they were durable, resisted fading, and made the logos pop. No one thought twice about it. You'd twist off the cap, take a swig, and maybe even collect the empty bottles for a few cents at the local store. Kids played with them, stacked them up, or even used them for makeshift science experiments. But the real science was happening in labs, where researchers began linking lead exposure to serious health risks, especially for children. By the late 20th century, regulations started phasing out lead in household products, including paint, gasoline, and eventually soda bottles. By the early 1990s, U.S. manufacturers had moved to safer alternatives. Today, soda branding is mostly done with paper or plastic labels, But for those who remember the old glass bottles, they were a piece of pop culture, with a little extra toxicity on the side. Elegant dinner parties in the early 20th century often featured a dish that would be unthinkable on modern menus: canned sea turtle. Prized for its rich, tender meat, sea turtle was considered a luxury item, not just in the United States but throughout Europe. Turtle soup, especially made from green sea turtles, was a favorite among the elite, and by the 1920s, commercial canning made it accessible to a broader audience. You didn't need to live near the coast or wrangle one yourself. You could simply order a tin through a catalog or find it in upscale grocers. The meat was typically simmered into a thick soup or stew, often with sherry, vegetables, and spices. Some recipes called for mock turtle alternatives using calf's head, but the real thing was the gold standard. In fact, sea turtle was so valued that it became a diplomatic dish, served at presidential banquets and state dinners. The demand, however, outpaced the supply. By mid-century, overhunting and habitat loss drove several sea turtle species toward extinction. International protections eventually made harvesting or selling sea turtles and their meat illegal in most of the world. Chemical names have caused as much unnecessary panic as dihydrogen monoxide. Despite sounding like something from a lab experiment gone wrong, this so-called hazardous substance was, in reality, nothing more than water. The term became the centerpiece of a long-running joke, highlighting how scientific jargon could manipulate public perception. In an era when food safety concerns were growing, misinformation had the power to create fear, even over something as essential as water. The 1960s saw increasing scrutiny over food additives, preservatives, and chemical compounds in everyday products. With rising concerns about artificial ingredients, people became more wary of what they consumed. The dihydrogen monoxide hoax played into that anxiety, proving how a lack of understanding could turn a necessity into a perceived threat. The irony? Every person alarmed by its presence had already been consuming it their entire lives. Though water itself is harmless in moderation, it's technically possible to overdose on it, a rare but real condition called water intoxication, where excessive consumption disrupts the body's sodium level. At the height of 1920s fine dining, few dishes carried more prestige or decadence than foie gras. Derived from the French for fat liver, this rich, buttery delicacy is made by force-feeding ducks or geese to enlarge their livers far beyond their natural size. While the technique dates back to ancient Egypt, it found a firm place on American menus during the Gilded Age and continued to grace the tables of upscale restaurants into the Jazz era. Foie gras was typically pan-seared, turned into pâté, or served cold in terrines. Its creamy texture and intense flavor made it a prized appetizer for those who could afford it. In culinary circles, it was viewed as a triumph of tradition and technique, though the method behind the product sparked unease even in its heyday. The controversy came to a head in recent decades. Animal welfare advocates raised concerns about the gavage process, where a feeding tube is inserted into the bird's throat multiple times daily. Several studies and undercover investigations led to public backlash and political action. Today, states like California and New York have banned the sale or production of foie gras entirely, citing cruelty in its creation. Bright, bold, and eye-catching, color mattered in the 1960s food industry, and few additives were as widely used as red No. 2 or amaranth. From candies to cake frosting, this synthetic dye gave processed foods an irresistible vibrancy. It was cheap, effective, and made everything look more appealing. But what manufacturers saw as a marketing advantage, scientists would later recognize as a serious health risk. At the time, food dyes weren't scrutinized as heavily as they are today. The general belief was that if a product made it to store shelves, it had to be safe. Red No. 2 was everywhere, with little concern for long-term effects. But as research advanced, animal studies suggested a troubling connection between this popular dye and potential carcinogenic properties. Though the data wasn't conclusive for humans, the idea of a cancer-causing colorant lurking in everyday foods was enough to raise alarms. Public pressure mounted, and by the 1970s, the FDA banned Red No. 2 in the US, following similar actions in Europe. While other artificial dyes remained in use, This case marked a turning point in food safety regulations. In high-end banquets and wedding halls of the early 20th century, few dishes signaled wealth and prestige quite like shark fin soup. Imported from China and served in upscale restaurants from San Francisco to New York, it was a luxury that symbolized success, not sustenance. At the time, Americans were embracing international cuisines, and shark fin quickly became a showpiece in fine dining circles, especially in cities with large Chinese communities. The preparation was meticulous. The fins were dried, cleaned, and soaked for hours before being simmered in a rich broth, often with chicken, ham, or mushrooms to boost the flavor. Because here's the kicker: shark fin itself is nearly tasteless. What it brought to the dish was texture, not taste, along with a tradition that dated back centuries in Chinese imperial kitchens. But as demand rose, the supply chain took a dark turn. The practice of shark finning, removing the fins and discarding the rest of the shark at sea, drew global outrage. Entire species faced population collapse, and the ecological consequences became impossible to ignore. In response, states like California, New York, and Hawaii enacted bans on shark fin sales, joining a growing list of countries with similar laws. Bright red candies, cherry-flavored snacks, and even some holiday treats in the 1970s owed their bold color to a single ingredient: red dye number 2. It was everywhere, from gumballs to cake frostings, giving sweets that signature vibrant hue that made them impossible to resist. At the time, artificial dyes were a standard part of food production, helping manufacturers make their products more visually appealing. After all, who wanted a dull pink candy when you could have a deep, fiery red one? The problem? Red dye. Number 2 wasn't as harmless as it looked. By the mid-1970s, scientific studies linked it to potential health risks, including concerns over carcinogenic effects. When Soviet researchers published findings suggesting a connection to cancer in lab rats, the US had no choice but to take a second look. Public concern mounted, and in 1976, the FDA banned the dye, triggering a nationwide panic. Some candy makers scrambled to find alternatives, while others simply pulled their red products from shelves altogether, resulting in the infamous disappearance of red M&Ms, even though they didn't actually contain the dye. Today, red dye number 2 is a thing of the past, but artificial food colorings are still debated. In the 1920s, fine dining didn't always mean filet mignon or lobster tail. Sometimes it meant a bite-sized bird served whole. Among the more unusual delicacies of the era was fried canary, along with other small songbirds like larks and finches. These tiny creatures were plucked, seasoned, and often pan-fried or roasted with herbs, then served in one piece, bones, beak, and all. The dish wasn't born of extravagance alone. In parts of Europe and among immigrant communities in America, small birds had long been a source of inexpensive protein. Preparation varied slightly by region, but the general method was simple. The bird was quickly cleaned, often singed over flame to remove feathers, and flash-fried until crispy. Diners would consume the entire bird in a few bites. In some circles, the experience was considered both culinary and cultural, a nod to old-world traditions. However, as bird populations began to decline and awareness of wildlife preservation grew, the tide turned. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, strengthened in later decades, made it illegal to hunt or sell most native songbirds. Conservation replaced cuisine as the priority, and what was once an edible novelty became a symbol of overindulgence at nature's expense. Lard was a really dominant fat, as you might already know. It's basically half the flavor in all of our fast food chains, and there are many hamburgers that wouldn't have their reputation without it. There are an equal number of people going to their doctor for cardiac issues at an alarmingly young age due to it as well. But why was pig fat rendered everyone's drug of choice? Well, in fast food frying, it was known for doing a few delicious things. It gave the food a crispy texture like nothing else did. It enhanced the flavor way better than any natural oils ever did. And since pork was already so widely produced and consumed just about, well, everywhere, it was also a lot more available and affordable than, let's say, unprocessed vegetable oils. This meant that it was ideal for the fast food industry, which almost always needed large-scale frying. Nowadays, there are places that still make lard-based fast food like in the old times, but most people were very happy trading away the flavor for the extra health gains. I guess if you really wanted an authentic one, you'd have to find somebody that tried them in the 50s because they used to use proper beef tallow back then, straight from the animal. It's still something you see a lot in little corners here and there, like Mexican-American cuisine or soul food, but as far as the mainstream goes, it's a relic of the past. Hidden beneath a linen napkin and centuries of controversy, one of the most secretive dishes in culinary history was quietly devoured: Ortolan bunting. This tiny songbird, no bigger than a thumb, was considered a delicacy among French gourmets and even found its way to American fine dining circles in the early 20th century. It wasn't necessity that put ortolan on the table. It was indulgence, pure and simple. Traditionally, the bird was captured at night using nets, then fattened in darkness, often with millet and figs. It was drowned in armagnac, roasted whole, and served intact, bones, beak, and all. Diners would cover their heads with a napkin while eating, supposedly to trap the aroma, though critics argued it was really to hide the act from God or perhaps from dinner companions with less adventurous appetites. By the late 20th century, the Ortolan population had sharply declined due to overhunting and habitat loss. France eventually banned its commercial sale in 1999 under pressure from environmentalists and the European Union. Today, catching or consuming the bird can carry heavy penalties, although black market dinners have reportedly continued in secret. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to like, subscribe, and let us know if you ever tried some of these foods in the comments below.